Good morning, folks. My name is Jimmy Bashara with the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest Resource Efficiency Evaluation Enhancements Phase 1 meeting to discuss the draft final proposal. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Danny Johnson, who will be the presenter for today, as well as Brittany Dean and Brad Cooper from our Policy Development Group. Also, Rahul Kalaskar, Robert Fisher, and Guillermo Bautista from our Market Analysis and Forecasting Group, as well as James Lynn from our Settlements Group. Today, as you can see, we'll be going over the latest round of stakeholder comments received and the related changes that we've made accordingly, followed by an overview of the proposal, and then lastly concluding with our proposed EIM classification and next steps. And I'll be filling in for Christina Osborne today, as you can see. As mentioned, we are on the draft final proposal stage, and for those unfamiliar with our stakeholder process, here is a simplified version of it. As you can see, after today's input, we'll draft the related business requirements specs and draft tariff language, which we'll incorporate into the final version, upcoming for discussion again, after which we'll take everything to the CAISO Board of Governors and EIM governing body for joint review for consideration for approval prior to filing any changes with FERC. And in addition, this call is recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to recordings after the meetings. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meeting. And we, of course, please request that the recordings and any related transcriptions not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And lastly, we'll be pausing for questions throughout. To raise your hands virtually, please press the raise hand icon to enter the queue. Unless you've dialed in separately without the computer, in which case, if you're using your phone, you would just you would push #2 to enter the queue. We do request verbal questions only, but if we do see any chat questions, we will verbalize those for folks as well. And with that, I'll hand it over to Danny.
Thanks, Jimmy. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So before we get started, I wanted to go over the purpose and the scope of this initiative again. As many of you are aware, we bifurcated this initiative into two separate phases, with the first phase focusing on accuracy improvements. It covers everything listed there on the left. We'll go into greater detail on all those items later today. Phase 2 originally was intended to just go through holistically the consequence enhancements. Since then, with the policy development of Phase 1, we've realized some items may need additional time for policy development or should just be considered later with the accuracy changes in place to see if additional policy development is warranted. And that would be the accuracy improvements we've added to Phase 2. The consideration of operator load adjustment was always there. We are planning to go through the consideration of selectively relaxing the test limitations. We observed an event this summer where multiple entities failed the FlexRAM sufficiency test down while exporting, and there was very high energy prices. This is a situation that we think warrants additional discussion of if this is a desired outcome from the RSC. We will also plan to go through the consideration of demand response misuse if we see any evidence of that occurring, as well as discuss the intertie uncertainty, the calculation for which Guillermo and Rahul and his team were able to put together some analysis on really recently that we published as a companion document to the draft final proposal. I think that analysis shows that there is additional policy development that needs to occur on this topic, but just the timing of when that analysis was put out means that we would defer that development to Phase 2 of this initiative. Next slide. So this first section, we're going to go through the stakeholder comments we received, how we digested them and thought through them, and then the changes that we're planning to make or that we made in the draft final proposal in response to the feedback we received from our stakeholders. Next slide. So these first two slides are elements of the policy proposal that we received broad support on. The support wasn't unanimous by any means, but it seemed like the majority of the stakeholder community was in alignment with the policy direction we proposed. There were some requests for clarification and detail, which I think we'll detail here, and we detailed in a lot more, or we had a lot more detail on in the draft final proposal. The first was the first policy element is the balancing test. We received positive feedback for the ISO's proposal to keep the balancing test in place, but to exclude the ISO or any entity that uses the day-ahead market to produce its input to the RSC from the balancing test. The stakeholders who pushed back on this idea did so under the premise that the ISO could also be underscheduled, which I think the CAISO freely admits. The balancing test isn't intended to prevent the ISO from being underscheduled or any entity from being underscheduled. It's to try to incent schedules that align with the expected forecast. The ISO simply doesn't have the ability to base schedule and strategically take advantage of the base scheduling process. So we think it would be inappropriate to apply this test to the ISO. For the flexible ramping sufficiency test, we received a lot of positive feedback about this direction. This is to add any power balance constraint relaxations back into the requirements for the flex ramp test. The questions we got were more along the lines of how this would work. The ISO has provided a graphic example in the draft final proposal with how we envision this working, which we will discuss later in this presentation. The ISO also proposed to exclude import awards that haven't submitted an ETAG transmission profile by T40. We received positive feedback on this. This is something that stakeholders think is appropriate. The request was for some data analysis of what the impact of this change would be. And the ISO has conducted this analysis, and we will also discuss this later. I think the analysis at a high level shows that this is warranted, that it would be warranted, in some of the stakeholder concerns about imports not always being delivered during certain hours or during certain seasons is somewhat warranted. So I think this reaffirms the ISO's policy direction that we're proposing to exclude these import awards. For emergency actions, we got a lot of agreement about the ISO's proposal to limit access to incremental transfers when a BAA is in an energy emergency and has taken exceptional actions such as using firm load to backfill reserves to free up that capacity and release it as energy to serve load. The EIM in this phase of the initiative is not something that we would look to enable those types of actions and encourage those actions as a means to further participate in the EIM. The questions we got on this were more along the lines of implementation, how this would potentially interact with the RC function. So we've added additional detail in the draft final proposal on this. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. For data transparency, the ISO is out of the data reporting game on the RSC. I think DMM has taken over this responsibility. They published their first report on 9/24. We had a call the following week going over the details of that report. I think through this process, the ISO would continue to ask for comment on the content of that report, any metrics that you think that the DMM would be able to produce that would be helpful that were not in that report. I think they would be open to considering. We also would like to solicit feedback on the data granularity that the ISO or DMM may look to publish on the underlying data that feeds into some of those metrics. Our initial thoughts are to report out at a BAA level to not give away too much proprietary information, potentially maybe a BAA resource-specific level data reporting. But we understand that some stakeholders have had a little bit of heartburn about this type of information being released previously. So prior to doing this, we would like to solicit feedback to understand where the stakeholder community is and what type of data regarding their RSE performance, they would be comfortable being publicly released. The final item which we had a lot of support for was our changes to the demand response participation. We have added additional detail on how we envision this functionality being used. We have also added detail and an optionality on whether the demand response would be incorporated into the load forecast. Right now, one of the limitations that we have is that the demand response to be included, our forecasting team has to switch their forecast model to include the demand response. And if the demand response isn't large enough, you could actually end up with a less accurate forecast using a climate-based model, including demand response, rather than their auto-regressive model. So we would like each EIM entity to be able to work with the ISO's forecasting team to figure out what is the right size of demand response, which they think would ultimately end up in their forecast. Based on stakeholder feedback, instead of creating any additional rules to prevent misuse of this functionality or changes to the underscheduling or balancing test, I think the ISO will propose to just require an attestation regarding the program being represented accurately. We think that this is a good compromise position that balances the stakeholder feedback that we received. I would add that in the second phase, to the extent that any observed misuse of this functionality does occur, we would have the ability to do additional development on penalties or a different framework to ensure that this functionality is not misused. Finally, the other thing that we're clarifying with the demand response is really this is a BAA by BAA choice of how their demand response can be represented for the purposes of the RSE. For the CAISO, we would plan to still consider only the PDR and RDRR resource models within the RSE. The no pay, no performance type DR doesn't have the same incentives with the CAISO's market models as it does with the base scheduling and imbalance settlement paradigm that EIM entities have. So I think for the ISO right now, the right thing to do is just to continue with our already developed DR participation models. This isn't to say that those other DRs will not be considered. They get considered via our autoregressive forecast. Once these programs are activated, they get incorporated into the forecast. During the next RSE interval, the forecast will be adjusted then to reflect the response to these demand response programs. So it's that they're not proactive or proactively counted, but they would be retroactively counted via our forecast. I'd like to pause there and see if we have any questions on the items which there was fairly broad support for.
Thanks, Daniel. I don't see anything in the chat. I'm not sure if we have anything in the queue.
Okay, I think we can move on then. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, okay, no questions in the queue. Okay.
All right, let's move forward. So the stakeholders also highlighted the proposal's lack of discussion regarding the treatment of storage, hybrid, and co-located resources. For hybrid and co-located resources, we would propose to treat them just based on their registered resource parameters. Storage resources are a little bit different. For the capacity test, we would propose to credit the initial state of charge during that time of the binding RSE, and then any bids to charge through that intervening time to the start of the hour, or then each 15-minute interval within that hour. For the FlexRAMP test, we would have that same methodology, but bids to charge or discharge, recognizing that these can go up and down. When we thought through this, it seemed inappropriate to credit the potential to charge through the entire stuck horizon. Our decision to use the stuck horizon for resources to start up is simply because they wouldn't be online and available to produce energy if they weren't dispatched on that horizon. Storage resources are always online. Their energy is dictated by the decisions that they make during that stuck horizon, but there is also a financial consideration and there are positive financial incentives for them to discharge at periods within that stuck horizon. So not recognizing that was not something that we thought would be appropriate for the RSE. We realize that storage is a very nuanced topic, and that this is an initial stab at how these should be treated for the RSE. we would be open to having additional policy development on a more nuanced consideration of storage for the capacity or flexible ramping sufficiency test in the second phase of this initiative. So we would ask for stakeholder feedback if they think we've landed in a reasonable place, or is this a reasonable place that will hold us over until we can do additional policy or development in phase 2, or do you think that we need to do something else for phase 1 of this initiative? Right now, storage would just be credited to its PMIN, PMAX, less any awards, I believe, for AS. So I think that this proposal at least somewhat narrows and tries to more accurately represent what we think storage may be able to, or how storage may be able to participate in the hour under evaluation of the RSE. Next slide. Thank you. So this is the first topic which we had mixed feedback from our market participants or our stakeholders. This is on the consideration of intertemporal constraints and the CAISO's proposal to credit and count capacity that was made available to the real-time market through the stuck horizon. We had a number of stakeholders, including DMM, the joint EIM entities, PG&E, 6 cities, SCE, SRP, Vistra, who were supportive of this proposal. They did request additional data on how this would have performed during the August events. I think luckily for us, Guillermo's team, and Guillermo did a lot of this analysis this spring as part of the market enhancements for summer of 2021 initiative, and it showed that this proposal would have excluded, I think, the type of resources that would never have been online, which were inappropriately, I think we'd all agree, probably shouldn't have been counted for the purpose of passing the capacity test. So I think it would have worked well in that context. We did get some requests for more granularity regarding the consideration of ramping as well as cold or warm startup types. We detailed cold and warm startup types in the proposal. Regarding the ramping, we think that's more appropriately addressed in the flexible ramp sufficiency test. We're trying to balance having the capacity test be more accurate, but not having it result in a test that is as complex and hard to work with as the flex ramp sufficiency test. There was an additional comment that asked us to consider use-limited resources, which may be use-limited on a time frame much longer than the RSE or stuck horizon. That's not a direction the ISO is proposing to go at this point. Our way of thinking about this is we want to credit resources that were made available for use to the real-time market, and those resources, for whatever reason, would not have been made available for use for the real-time market, so we don't think it would be appropriate to credit that and count that capacity for an EIM participant. There were a number of stakeholders who did not support this proposed direction. This would be BPA, Public Generating Pool, PPC. What I took away from the comments is there's a disagreement with counting capacity that's not online and available during the hour the RSE is evaluating. Their view would be that the RSE should simply be a check of what's available in that upcoming hour, irregardless of why it would be available or not available. And I think we understand that, but can we go to the next slide? We would, I think, disagree because we don't think, or doing that could create negative incentives. To the ISO, if an entity makes their capacity available for the real-time market for use, that's the intent of the RSE, that each entity is making enough capacity available to the real-time market to meet their forecasted demand and uncertainty, and we think that this proposal does that. I'd like to pause and see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Danny. Still no chat questions, and it sounds like nothing in the queue.
Okay, I think we can move forward then. So the next item, which we received mixed stakeholder feedback from, was the consideration of load conformance within the RSE. The ISO's proposal in the straw phase of this initiative was to defer the consideration of load conformance until the phase 2 policy development. This was supported by the MSC, NVE, PG&E, and Vistra. There were a number of stakeholders who did not support this and would like the ISO to address load conformance and add this to the requirements of the RSC. In the first phase of this initiative, this would primarily be BPA, the joint EIM entities, and PPC. The comment suggested that some stakeholders believe that the ability to use load conformance benefits the CAISO in ways not available to other EIM participants. We also heard feedback with varying level of confidence regarding some of the ISO's other market policy development initiatives, which we think should reduce the need for load conformance. There was not a lot of confidence in those being implemented in a timely manner. And under that premise, there was also a push to include this in phase one of the proposal. Can we go to the next slide? So the ISO, I think we're actually stepping back a little bit from where we were the straw proposal. When we thought this through and tried to leverage the discussion that we had at the MSC meeting on August 27th, we really came to the conclusion that the reason that ISO uses load conformance is functionally the same as a lot of the abilities that EIM entities have through their bilateral and base scheduling participation in the EIM. What I mean by this is the ISO primarily does this to either drive additional import supply, block hourly imports, or to commit additional internal generation. EIM entities who participate through base scheduling are able to bilaterally transact for as much import capacity as they deem necessary and are able to base schedule online additional resources if they decide that they want to. This is just the ISO's market mechanism to take those same actions that I guess the ISO could manually dispatch resources, but to us, we have the ability to conform the load to let the market make the most economic choice to either secure more import supply or turn on the most efficient resource, and we don't think it would be appropriate to limit the ISO's ability to do this, nor do we think that the ISO ability to do this should preclude or add to its burden to participate in the EIM, since functionally EIM entities have the same ability to do this. I think we have a question.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Danny. I do have a question from Elaine asking, could you please explain the negative incentives that BPA's proposal encourages on slide 10 for the capacity test? Let me go back to slide 10.
Sure. So the negative incentives would be in the stuck horizon if a resource is not deemed necessary to meet forecasted load. The fact that it is a co-optimized solution for the entire area means that under BPA's solution, each entity or the CAISO would be running a ISO-specific BAA optimization to turn on additional resources that weren't deemed necessary through a co-optimized model on the longer horizon. It would simply be adding an additional binding model with a more narrow objective to ensure EIM participation when the stuck runs and the market optimization doesn't think those resources would be needed.
Thanks, Danny.
And we did have a question in the verbal queue as well. If you'd still like to ask your question, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, good morning, Danny. It's Jeff Spires. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, Jeff, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
All right.
Good. Thanks for the additional detail around the CAISO's thinking on the load conformance. It's just helpful to understand better what your perspective is on this. But I also think that the explanation you gave provides an opportunity to give a point of clarification around, at least from my perspective, what the issue is and what it isn't. A moment ago, you were basically suggesting that the load conformance is really the same concept or functionally the same as an EIM entity using bilateral transactions ahead of the EIM to help meet their sufficiency needs. And, I think what's really worth clarifying here is that if the CAISO wants to count import supply that it's secured through the intertie bidding framework in advance of the EIM, whether that's day-ahead market awards or through the House, then provided that those imports have E-tags, and I know that's another element of the discussion later, but we don't have an issue with the CAISO arranging for supply through the intertie bidding framework, day-ahead or House, including if those imports are increased by biasing those markets. So if the CAISO wants to use load biasing in the dam or in the House to increase the quantity of imports that it arranges in advance of the EIM, I think that would be fine because those are, as you were pointing out before, those are advanced purchases of supply that are secured outside of the EIM in advance. The issue that we've been raising, though, around the load biasing is that currently it's going beyond that. It's going beyond buying imports ahead of time prior to the EIM, and it's actually being used in the EIM dispatch itself to increase EIM imports. And that's different. That's not the same as making a bilateral transaction ahead of time. That's where the load biasing is changing the EIM dispatch, increasing the EIM imports into the CAISO VA, and distorting the test because it's creating unloaded headroom on internal resources that contribute to passing the flex test. And then it also changes the transfer quantity that's used to define the failure consequences. So I just wanted to make that distinction because I do think, to the extent that the CAISO is arranging for bilateral transactions effectively or intertie bidding transactions prior to EIM, I don't think there's an issue around that, and there are some similarities to EIM entities' bilateral transactions. They're secured and paid for up front. But really what I think the issue we're trying to raise here is around load conformance in the EIM dispatch itself. I'll just stop there to see what your reaction is, but I wanted to make that clarification.
Yeah, I think I understand your perspective. I think that the point you raised regarding the consequences of failure for the RSC and the transfers being locked at a higher level is something that I think that we will discuss in phase 2 of this initiative. I think that the fact that the ISO is able to have more EIM imports within the hour is a function that's available to all market participants. This isn't something that only the ISO can do. This is available to everybody. The ISO, if we do the load conformance and the HASP run, we typically have to maintain that conformance in the subsequent RPTD runs to make sure that we retain those or the unloaded capacity or don't turn off resources or essentially guarantee that additional flexibility that we've tried to obtain via conforming in the HASP run. So I do take your point regarding the failure consequences and the idea that EIM entities may want those to be not as high or more reflective of the unloaded headroom, or the transfers to be more reflective of the unloaded headroom during failure. But I think that's a discussion that we should have in the phase 2 of this initiative when we actually consider the consequences for RSC failure.
Okay, thanks, Danny. I appreciate that feedback, and I know that the ISO is pretty set on pushing this issue into phase 2. But I just think in terms of characterizing what the issue is, it's important to make that distinction to say the biasing that we're referring to and the impacts to the EIM dispatch and RS test are not the same as the bilateral transactions that EIM entities make prior to the EIM. And I just thought that was important because I think it can add some confusion to what the issues are here and why we're focused on the load biasing that's going on specifically within the EIM itself to create those imports. So I appreciate the opportunity to comment.
Thanks, Jeff. And I look forward to trying to resolve this issue in the future. I think if I could summarize it, the issue would be the additional imports that the load conformance drives from the EIM, which are credited back to EIM entities for their flex ramp test. So I guess they're not penalized, but the issue would be an entity could use the load conformance and then be locked at a higher transfer if they fail the test, which I think is something that does need additional discussion, but we have a venue already that we plan to discuss that in. So thank you.
Yeah, Danny, just one additional point there is it also, when you do that, you're right, it locks the EIM transfers at a higher level during the periods of failure, but also it creates more headroom on internal resources that get used to meet the test in the following hour. So even in hours when the VA is passing, bringing in more EIM imports by using load conformance creates more headroom on internal resources, and that goes into meeting the flex test for the following hour. So I think there are two impacts there that play a role in those outcomes.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
We do have a couple more people in the queue if you'd like me to continue.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, next caller, your line's unmuted.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vista. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hey, Kathleen.
Okay, great. Yeah, hi, Danny. I just wanted to jump in and respond, I think, more to something that's on the slide rather than, I don't know if I've heard you make a call for any verbal feedback on the phase 2. But the language on your slide that says if desired by stakeholders kind of pinged me a little bit, and I was like, well, I wanted to jump in and just share on this call and reemphasize that we, as you mentioned, we support you deferring this element to phase 2 because it is pretty complex. And at least in my mind and our minds, I don't have a strong sense of how often the load biases are being used specifically to adjust based on an expectation of the load target versus being used, let's say, to drive other types of commitments, like you mentioned examples, to achieve greater flexibility or to meet other operational concerns. Until we have a better sense of that, we agree with the CAISO that we should be deferring this until the next phase. But I did want to echo that we do think this is important. It's a complex question, really driven by how the conformance is being used by operators, and just want to encourage the CAISO to keep this within scope of phase 2. So at least from our perspective, VISTA does desire that the load conformance stay in scope for phase 2. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Kathleen. I think we have one more question in the queue from Dan at CES.
Yeah, hi, this is Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. I'm just wanting to follow up on something that was discussed in the DMM call, and that was there was a request from a stakeholder about capturing the drivers for load conformance and how that may be different in the EIM areas versus in the non-CAISO EIM areas versus the CAISO VA. Is that something that CAISO is going to work on as we maybe prepare for phase 2, or is that something that's more in DMM's more on their side to work on following up on that?
Well, Ben, I don't think load conformance is something we're considering within the RSC and proposing to potentially consider in phase 2. I don't know if it fully falls within the purview of DMM since it's native to a lot of ISO market interactions that aren't the RSC. So I think to the extent that additional analysis is needed, we would ask that stakeholders let us know through this comment form so we can try to formulate how we'd want to conduct that analysis and get something out there that helps inform the community.
Okay. Yeah, I guess from the DMM report, it definitely looked like the use of load conformance was more random isn't quite the right word, but just spread differently across the day for the EIM areas. It seemed to be being used more for maybe anomalies in the market model and that sort of thing versus the CAISO load conformance has been shaped much more toward the ramping needs over the evening peak. And I think the question from the commenter during that DMM meeting was just whether we could do more to try and capture the drivers for that. So if that's something that the CAISO can do, then I think that would be a good follow-up as we get ready for phase 2.
Yeah, Dan, I think that, like you said, that I think, or at a high level, the drivers would be different because the CAISO uses the load conformance to try to bilateral or to try to transact more block hourly imports or as a economic means to turn units on. But I also have Guillermo on the call with me, and I think that he wanted to chime in on this. Guillermo, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. You are right that this is not per se a topic of the resource efficiency evaluation, but I just want to add some context and background to Dan's question. Years back, maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago, there was an effort done, and I think that discussion happened because we implemented a feature in the market related to load conformance. It was a pricing mechanism that we implemented, and as part of that discussion, we undertook the effort to track more precisely the reasons of the load conformance, not only for the CAISO, but also for each EIM entity. Indeed, we went through the task of identifying and grouping the reasons as to why the CAISO and the EIM entities can use the load conformance. And you are right, the reasons for which the CAISO is conforming is naturally different for the reasons of the EIM entities using the conformance. And we do have in our systems, and I thought there was some expectation of reporting those as to what the reason was. That information is already available. That information is already captured. We already took the effort to classify the main drivers for the load conformance. Again, not only for the CAISO, but also for all the EIM entities. And obviously, the grouping that we have and we have utilized to classify those are large groups. For instance, in the CAISO, I recall we have these classifications of resource deviation, for instance, right? And that could be a variety of what the resource deviation may mean. But the data is already there. So I think we endeavor that part as a complement to the discussion that we have a few years ago when we implemented the enhancement to the load conformance pricing mechanism.
Okay, so that should be capturing something, I guess, is the takeaway there, that even if they're not the most granular buckets for identifying what the reasons are, there should be some data out there that maybe DMM could use for reporting some of the drivers if they wanted to drill down into that. I guess I was just trying to follow up on the request that was made by, I think it was a representative from LDWP who made the request on the DMM call, and I was just curious if there'd been any more discussion on that.
Yeah, all the data that are available.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any more callers in the queue?
No more callers in the queue.
Okay, great. I think we could jump to the next slide. So the last point that we received varying levels of feedback on was when phase 2 of this initiative would start. There was a group of entities who would like phase 2 to start immediately after the conclusion of phase 1, and then another group who were more in alignment with the ISO's initial proposal to implement the phase 1 accuracy enhancements, see how those are working, and then begin the phase 2 policy development. I think the ISO would be open to starting this sooner if that's where the stakeholder community is at, but we would ask if stakeholders can detail what the benefit they think of starting this sooner is. Is there a target date that they'd be looking for the policy to be done by and implemented by? I think this would be useful information as our executive team and policy development team consider our roadmap for 2022 and 2023 policy development, so we can figure out where this slots in with the other priorities that the ISO has. I think this is the last slide before we go to the proposal itself, so I'll stop one more time for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I don't think we have any questions, but as a reminder, folks, push the raise hand icon if you wish to ask a question, or #2 if you dialed in separately.
All right, I think we can jump forward. Next slide, Jimmy. Thank you. So the first thing we wanted to talk about was that the ISO is out of the RSC reporting game. We have transitioned all reporting responsibilities for the EIM RSC to the Department of Market Monitoring. They issued their first report, like I talked about earlier, at the end of September. We had a call where stakeholders were able to ask questions about that report and give the DMM feedback. We would like to use this as a platform to also solicit feedback in an easily consumable form for the DMM to consider as they continue to develop additional matrices and figure out what level of data they want to publish. We would also note that we are still working to provide the DMM a platform to easily report out more real-time or near-time metrics on RSC performance that stakeholders may be interested in, as well as the ability to publish the underlying data, which can be a lot of data in an easily consumable form somewhere on the ISO's website, since I think our infrastructure to do this might help them. The other thing I want to clarify is regarding the role of the EIM governing body market expert. I think there may have been a little bit of confusion with the wording in the straw proposal about how this role would interact with the RSC. The ISO is not presuming to dictate how the EIM governing body market expert does its job. That is completely at the discretion of the EIM governing body. The ISO just wants to publicly commit to help the EIM governing body market expert obtain whatever data they need to fulfill their role as prescribed by the EIM governing body. Next slide. So we are proposing to provide additional data transparency to help entities engage with the RSC. This serves two purposes. The first would be for entities to see how their inputs are being considered, to essentially benchmark and make sure that the RSC is functioning correctly and giving them the results that they think it should based upon their inputs. The other benefit would be more detailed information about the RSC performance and how the RSC is considering different resources in the real-time horizon should help EIM entity operators better engage with the test and hopefully give them greater ability to use the curing periods of the advisory tests to update their base schedules to ultimately pass the test. These, all this additional information that we list on the next slide will be somewhere in either CMRI or BOP would be our plan. I think we would look to use the BRS process to figure out where those best land. But this would be the data that the ISO would look to put out for each test that is available to each EIM entity to help them fulfill both of those functions I just discussed. Next slide. So this is something we've already talked about. The ISO regarding intertemporal constraints would propose to count the capacity made available for use by the real-time market. We would count the capacity that is online in the hour under evaluation, as well as capacity that was made available through the stuck horizon that ends in the hour under evaluation, but for economic decisions of the stuck horizon is not available. We believe that this achieves the objective of excluding the capacity that the real-time market wouldn't be able to access, which was really what was highlighted by the events of August of 2020. There was capacity that the real-time market would have never been able to access that under this paradigm would have been properly excluded from being counted per the ISO. We also think this is a compromise position that prevents incentives to make uneconomic decisions to ensure EIM participation. If we have a market optimization that deems a resource isn't needed, we think it would be a step backward to expect EIM entities or the ISO to be manually dispatching and base scheduling resources online that aren't needed just to ensure their EIM participation. Finally, we have updated the counting rules for storage and would look to use the state of charge as an initial reference for crediting storage for the purposes of the RSE. Next slide. The CAISO disagrees that load conformance should be considered in the RSE requirements. I think we've already discussed this in some detail. Our reasoning is basically what we discussed earlier. This is just the ISO's way of trying to drive block hourly resources or using an efficient market mechanism to commit additional internal resources. When we have in here, I think we have in a way that captures these functions for all EIM entities. That's what we're struggling with, is unpacking the fact that the ISO uses load conformance to do this from the transfers that the EIM transfers it drives in the following hour, and I think that's what we would try to work through if there's stakeholder support for working through that in the second phase of this proposal. I would also like to note that if EIM entities believe there is an advantage to be gained from using load conformance, that this is not a function that's only available to the ISO. It is available to all EIM entities. I think we have a couple more questions, so we can pause.
Hi, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vista again. Danny, do you mind going back a slide? I had a request for the capacity test. Oh, okay, awesome. And also just verbalizing for the broader stakeholder community, one of the asks that Vista had in our comments, and I wanted to see if you had could provide a little bit more back and forth on it, is that, you know, we understand what you're saying about not wanting to overcomplicate the test and wanting to kind of balance what the flexible ramping one test is doing versus the capacity test. I think our gut reaction to the proposal for the resources that can be started and come on, that aren't online, that can come online, and giving it credit for its full P-max, that might be overly generous if the resource itself can ramp up to P-min, but it's not able to ramp all the way from its minimum operating level to its maximum operating level during the time period that you're doing this test. And I know we had asked for there's some kind of simple approach to at least account for this specific ramping limitation, not so much the complexity of if you're online and what you can ramp to based on the initial condition, but for resources that are being turned on, if they can't, it seems like at least it would be more conservative to only credit it for its minimum operating level. I was wondering if you could shed a little bit of your thinking on that request that we submitted.
Yeah, our thought was, again, to try to keep this a little less complicated and keep the ramping constraints in the flex ramp test. I think I understand what you're saying. I think the flex ramp test should cover most of these circumstances. The RSE two tests do work together in that way, that the capacity test would see if there's enough capacity, and then the flex ramp test is checking to see if there's accessible capacity to ramp to variations in demand. On the simple approach, I think it would be hard to do a simple approach on this without making it really complicated. The only thing I can think of is maybe a simple check of could it ramp to like more than halfway towards its P-max or X% of its P-max, and then either round up or down. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
That is very close to the simple approach. A probably cruder approach, more of a hammer than a scalpel, would be just to include the P-min as opposed to assume it can get to its, include the commitments, you account for the P-min. But the approach that you just kind of laid out of a midpoint or some kind of check for feasibility is even more precise and would be preferable if it's possible. We just are concerned that we don't want to over credit for capacity that is not able to be started up. And but I think either preference for only crediting it for its PMIN unless you can implement something that would be a check like you just described that also does make some sense on something on a midpoint of the operating range kind of is intuitive to me unless we can have better confidence that it can reach that PMAX level. But just appreciate the CAISO hearing it out loud and sharing with other stakeholders our concern that we don't want to be over accounting for resources if it can't reach that max point. Thank you.
Yeah, I thanks for your comments, Kathleen. I think in our request for comment on this, I can write up a question that kind of tries to see where stakeholders are comfortable with what type of capacity would be counted to see where the broader stakeholder community is. I understand this was concerned, and I understand why. We just have to balance where everybody wants this to land. But I do think that's a valid concern, so thank you for your comment. I think we have one more caller in the queue.
You're unmuted. Please go ahead.
Oh, there we go. Good morning. It's Mark Simons at the Bonneville Power Administration. Danny, you can hear me, right?
Yes. Good morning, Mark.
Okay. Morning. How are you? Sorry, it took a little bit of time there to get off mute, I guess. You know, I really appreciate the question that Kathleen was just asking. I think if you all could structure a question in your comments that gets more at how you select the quantity of capacity to choose to include in the test, this would be important as we continue to provide comments on this proposal. The 5 scenarios that you laid out in both the draft final as well as the earlier version are really helpful and educational to allow commenters to provide very specific feedback on how capacity can be credited for the capacity test. I think another piece of information that would be helpful for stakeholders as they're considering this is if the ISO sees any differences in how this and the next topic on the subsequent slide kind of interact in maybe different ways between EIM entities and the ISO, such that you've got a situation where capacity may be credited and counted differently between the EIM entities and the ISO itself. So I think if you guys could structure a question along those lines, that'd be helpful to further this discussion. Because as you can tell, and as you summarize from our comments, it's really important that the capacity that's made available for this test is actually available inside of the operating hour that's being tested.
Yeah, Mark, I think we can have a question that solicits feedback on how we would want to try to count some of this capacity. Are there any other questions in the queue?
No further questions.
Okay, so the next thing that we're going to be talking about is the consideration of demand response. The ISO wants to allow demand response programs expected load modifications to be accounted for in the RSE. This would be decided on a BAA specific level, what types of programs that they are able to access that they would want to be counted for the RSE. Again, for the ISO, we would look to limit explicit DR participation to the PDR and RDRR models and let the non-supply side participation be included via the auto-regressive load forecast. The adjustments would be made at the CLAP using LDS provided by an EIM entity. We would propose to require an attestation of accurate representation of the demand response program and would trigger the automatic application of the over and under scheduling tests when any modifications are made, essentially viewing these modifications as the EIM entity choosing to have an EIM entity specific load forecast that's just based on the ISO's initial load forecast. Now, I know that the DR topic has come up in a few different venues, some of the EIM quarterly meetings, and I think even a DMM meeting. So I wanted to pause and see if there's any questions regarding the demand response participation. And I see we do have a couple questions. So.
First caller is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Ryan Millard from PG. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hi, Ryan.
So PG continues to have some concerns about the viability of what you're proposing here in operational context. I understand the policy arguments for misuse. I think it's an extreme example. So let me offer you another extreme counter example, and I'd like your feedback on this. So back in June, on June 28th, at hours 1300 and 1400, the CAISO was forecasting 5,000 megawatts for the PGEVA. We were calling the CAISO and saying that your load forecast was extreme and there was no way we were going to hit 5,000 megawatts. Our actuals never peaked above 4,500. So the CAISO took the time and effort to get readjusted. But what if our operator at hour 1300 was supposed to implement our DR program and they know that if they get it wrong, PG is subject to penalties? We don't use DR every day. We're going to use DR when our load is highest. So as an operator, am I going to take a run at moving 5,000 megawatts down to 4,500? No. In the day-to-day real-life context, because of that incentive you've identified, it will be very hard to convince an operator to use this. You will have to have a business process, probably a manager sitting there with the operator telling them it's okay to do this and that no one's going to come back and tell you that you cost the company $50,000 or $100,000 because you adjusted the load forecast. There's too much uncertainty there for the operator as to whether by adjusting for DR that load forecast actual is going to pan out to be within 5%. They don't know that with 100% dead certainty. So that was the main concern that we had with the application of the penalties associated with this proposal.
Okay, thank you for your comment, Ryan. I think hearing that, the real concern is that there's a penalty if the load forecast comes in way under what the forecast is, not so much that demand response is the driver of that concern. It just kind of adds on top of what may already be a concern with forecast accuracy.
Yes, and the fact that, we're going to be operating, or most of folks are going to be operating these DR programs during those, extreme events. I guess I'm kind of curious whether you contemplated or would be open to contemplating. So let me give you another example. Right now, if the VA operator has a load bias in and we go infeasible, say we go infeasible by 10 megawatts and we have a load bias in for 30 megawatts and we have infeasibility prices that kick in and we hit $1,000, CAISO will adjust those prices because it was an operator-inflicted shortage. We weren't actually short. What about an alternative proposal that would state that if you attest to a DR program and the load forecast is off and creates a penalty, if the operator stayed within the DR limit that they attested to, the penalty is waived? Meaning there's still some uncertainty for the operator as to whether by adjusting for DR that load forecast actual is going to pan out to be within 5%. But we can arm them with some level of comfort that we've attested to, say, 50 megawatts of DR. And as long as they do 50 megawatts or less in accordance with our program, when this all shakes out, there wouldn't be a penalty associated with that.
Yeah, I'm trying to visualize how this would work, and I guess I'm struggling a little bit with the band of being within a band for these DR programs. Can you walk me through that one more time?
So I'm thinking about in the context of the feasibility pricing, and what we'd basically be saying is we are going to stay within the amount of megawatts that we attested to that we were going to implement in our DR program, or less, so long as you came in at or below, there wouldn't be a penalty associated with that. But if you went over that amount, then you would incur a penalty. So it'll allow for some level of uncertainty, but not the level of certainty that would be required in what you've proposed here, meaning they would have to stay under 5%.
So to summarize and make sure I understand this, you would propose that the underscheduling penalty be 5% plus some percentage of the DR participation that you'd expect. So if you have a 50 megawatt DR program and maybe 80% shows up, then it would be 5% plus 40 megawatts.
I think that's right. Granted, I'm kind of going off the cuff here, and this is something that we could put into our comments to kind of think through. But at a high level, yeah, I think so.
Okay, yeah, I think this is helpful. If you can put this in your comments, that would be appreciated. I don't think this is something that ISO would be opposed to. We just hadn't thought through the scenario of large forecast errors in combination with DR and how that might impact your operators and business practices. I think that's something we'd be willing to consider if you want to put this proposal into your comments. Because we don't intend for, we don't want to limit the DR participation or make entities question how it's used or make this a friction point. We just want to make sure that it's not being routinely used to be 4% under scheduled and pass the RC would be our concern.
Understood, and acknowledge that concern. I'm just trying to highlight a concern in the opposite extreme of that. So we'll put these in some comments for your consideration.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Daniel, do you see a couple more questions in the queue?
Okay.
The next caller is unmuted. If you can please go ahead. Tyler Moore.
Hi. Good morning, Danny. Tyler Moore, APS. I have two questions. One similar to the one Ryan had there on the over-under scheduling test. But the first one I wanted to ask about is the load distribution factor. I'm trying to understand how this adjustment would be made by the operator. And for our DR programs, we usually get a forecasted load increase for pre-cooling and load decrease when the DR starts. And just making sure we'll be able to give the adjustment in the form that the CAISO wants. And I'm not exactly sure how we translate megawatts forecasted from the DR program into these load distribution factors and what that would entail. So if you could highlight a little bit more on that.
Our thought would be if you're forecasting 10 megawatts of load at a node and you think DR is going to reduce that to 9 megawatts, you let us know that there's a 10% reduction expected at this node. So I guess percentages of reduction at the nodes would be one way to do it.
Okay, and then for like an EIM entity, is the node then just our ELAP if we only have that? We don't have any custom ones?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And would it be possible to do that in megawatts? I think it might be easier just based on what I know about our programs and instead of doing it as percentage.
Yeah, I think that we would be open to figuring out the way to most accurately map this DR reduction within our model. I think this probably is a question that we can address in the BRS development, but I think this would be something that the ISO is open to working to figure out the right way to do this.
Okay, that makes sense. I just want to make sure I generally understood what would happen there. And then on the over-under scheduling test, and we've had the same type of conversations around the load forecast, and then with the new proposal triggering the over/under scheduling test, and then actuals coming outside of 5%, but then maybe the larger portion of that is due to load forecast at the beginning, where we could have balanced within 1% and avoided the test if we didn't have a DR program in the same hour. And one, I kind of like that 5% plus the DR megawatt adjustment. I think we may write some comments on that, but I wanted to ask about, is there any potential, and this would probably be later in the settlements timeline, but we do get actual data, I don't know exactly when, a few weeks after, from the program's performance, and I don't know if that can be incorporated into the over/under scheduling test to see if, the adjustment we made in the hour versus how it actually impacted the load could be taken into account before applying under scheduling penalties.
I think that would be something that would be helpful if you can detail in your comments. I do see that I have James Lynn on the call with me, so I wanted to see what his initial take would be on that, since he is our settlements guru. James, are you there?
Yes, I was working on the double mute. Actually, I like to I think about it. I don't have an answer at this time. So I want to think about the question and the thought, and then get back to you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, James. Thanks, Danny.
Yep. Thank you for your comments.
No problem.
Hi, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
Hi, Kathleen.
Hi. I just wanted to make a plug for, one of the asks that we had suggested is that in the case that a local regulatory authority anywhere within the EIM footprint doesn't have clear measurement and verification rules when there's some latitude, it would be beneficial if the CAISO did provide some best practice principles. In this phase, we do think that it would be great in this phase, in the instance that does not exist, with the understanding that if LRA rules are clear on how that should be forecasted, that would be the prevailing rule. But in the instance there may be some ambiguity, we do think that there's a benefit of the CAISO detailing what a default approach would be, and we just wanted to make that request again. In our view, there's a couple best practices across the DR community for the operational reports that are provided near to real time. That would be equivalent to what this the use in the RFE. For instance, that a couple of best practices are that the baselines used should come from recent operations, as well as that there is some touch point between like a day ahead to real time of confirmation that a customer intends to actively respond. So it's not a passive load reduction, it is a active load reduction. I think those are a couple of best practices that are worth considering for default M&D if there doesn't happen to be an LRA rule.
So are you suggesting then, Kathleen, that we might detail some of these best practices within the attestation of accurate representation that the program would have to adhere to? I'm not proposing you consider any specific implementation route. I think that is one route. Detailing it in the manuals for reference is another route. I think conceptually along those lines, just having some documentation or even the attestation, I assume, would point to the manual, so it would kind of be the equivalent. Yeah. I'm trying to think this through, and I think we were trying to be a little bit careful and actually not stick the ISO's nose into prescribing how EIM entities run their demand response programs under their LRAs. So this is something we can give some thought to, but I don't know where we're going to land, because we're trying to leave this to the discretion of the EIM entities and then just let the penalties serve as a deterrence for misuse.
And I appreciate that, Danny, and I think I'm trying to thread that needle as well, which is why our suggestion is to provide the suggested approach in the absence of an LRA requirement or procedure. So that is kind of that is the needle that I'm trying to thread. Because I understand where you're coming from, but just as an option out there in the absence of an LRA process could be helpful to avoid any complications of this implementation. As an alternative, I would just ask us to keep this as a placeholder for phase 2 if we do identify that there was any ambiguity or refinements that are needed for that kind of instance.
Okay. Thank you for your comment, Kathleen. Are there any other callers in the queue? Oh, nope, they disappeared on my screen. Can we move to the next slide? So the CAISO, again, proposes to limit interchange schedules that will count in the RSE to those that it believes will be reliably delivered. We would use the intertie deviation settlements T40 deadline for the transmission profile of an ETAG being due, and then any block hourly awards that didn't have this ETAG at T40 would get a haircut going into that final RSE run to ensure that the capacity that the CAISO's counting is accurate. This does create a discount of a decent amount of capacity. I think the next 2 slides, if we can go to, are the analysis that the ISO conducted. It does show that there is a pretty good amount of intertie deviation still, and there's one more slide. This slide, I think, does a better job of showing that the deviation is pretty strongly correlated to peak summer months and then times of a lot of ramping. So I think this reinforces the ISO's proposal to give haircuts to awards that don't show up or that don't have the transmission profile ETAG, and does recognize the concern that there is the potential for undeliverable awards. Can we go to the next slide? So on the flexible ramp sufficiency test, the CAISO's proposed changes should serve to reduce the occurrence of anomalous results. This is the market schedule that gets used as the reference point for the calculation of the flexible ramping requirement. To the extent that there's a power balance constraint relaxation, it skews the reference point from which the requirements are derived. So we would simply be looking to add to the upward requirements the amount of the power balance constraint relaxation and then deduct that from the downward requirements to have that test be more accurate from where the system actually should have been in that FMM interval immediately prior to the hour to where we think it needs to go. The next slide, I think, has a graphic example that we pulled from the draft final proposal that highlights this. It's simply indexing up by the PVC constraint relaxation, the requirements for the flex ramp sufficiency test. So hopefully this clarifies any confusion regarding implementation. Next slide. So again, the CAISO proposes to revise the balancing test to exclude any entity who is not subject to it from any revenue disbursement. We thought through and considered all the comments that we received, and there were some comments that even proposed to get rid of the balancing test. We think that there's still a reason to have it. The overscheduling problem that we detail in the draft final proposal could be exploited to selectively get congestion and receive imbalance. The underscheduling serves to prevent underschedules and also has the double purpose of being a backstop for misuse and preventing the misuse of demand response to pass the RSC. So we do think that it's warranted to keep these tests in place, and we've given examples that kind of highlighted why we think that they are still relevant. However, again, the fact that the ISO and any market participant who would become a full member of the ISO who doesn't utilize the base scheduling process, we don't think has the same incentives, and the test should not be applied to them. Next slide. This is just a graphic that details the amount of underscheduling failures we saw. This is for the last calendar year, more or less. So while this test does get applied and there are failures, the amount of failures that actually result in underscheduling penalties are fairly limited. I mean, we're talking 5 to 20 failures basically across the last year. So that's just trying to help set how the test is currently being applied. This would tell me that it's working, that the test is driving balanced schedules, and is also worth keeping for that reason. Next slide, please. This is the CAISO's proposed treatment for emergency actions we think is appropriate. This would be to limit incremental EIM transfers while a BAA is utilizing firm load as reserves. We would propose to have something within our software suite which would allow EIM entities to let the CAISO know that they're in this situation and that they're taking these emergency actions, and then the software would limit the incremental transfers. We would propose to require an attestation that entities would let us know when they're in this situation. This is our solution to remove any potential interaction with the RC function, either RC West or any other RCs in the Western interconnection. We want to try to keep that separate from the ability for an EIM entity to participate in the EIMs, to keep the market function and the reliability function a little bit separate if possible, and we think that this solution does that. I see we have a question in the queue, so I'll pause.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My question is the utilization of firm load as reserves the only indicator of being in an emergency condition that would trigger the limitation on incremental transfers? I mean, are there other things that would signal an emergency condition that, could or should lead to the same limitation?
Thanks, Bonnie. I think right now our only trigger would be utilizing firm load as reserves. If stakeholders feel there are other potential triggers which would indicate an entity shouldn't be able to access incremental transfers, we'd be open to considering them.
Well, what about, for example, drawing on some sort of a reserve sharing pool? Or an emergency reserve sharing pool, I guess. I mean, a reserve sharing pool that would be kind of an everyday activity might not be an appropriate emergency trigger, but if there are calls, for emergency reserve sharing, why would you want to exclude that?
Are you saying that should or should not limit incremental transfers?
I guess I'm saying that I'm questioning whether it's appropriate simply to look at utilization of firm load as reserves as the only indicator of an emergency condition, and might that allow BAAs that are in emergency conditions but react in some way other than utilizing firm load as reserves to avoid that limitation?
So I think I follow your question, Bonnie. To me, this leads into the consideration of failure consequences a little bit. This proposal is a backstop where you are unambiguously in an emergency. You're utilizing firm load. The gray area you're identifying is under what context should emergency assistance kind of prevent incremental EIM participation, or under a different consequence paradigm is maybe that type of assistance priced differently. And so thinking through it, to me, that gray area we will probably have additional discussion on when we consider failure consequences.
So what you're saying is that this is the only indicator that you want to activate now, but you'll be open to considering others perhaps as time goes on.
Yeah, I think we'd definitely be open to changing what we would consider emergency actions that should prevent EIM use if there's like broad support across the stakeholder community for doing that. Right now, this was the only item, or these are the only actions that seem to have that support. So I do think in that consequence discussion, we'll either potentially add additional actions or try to revise how those actions are treated by the EIM to compensate the entities who are providing assistance.
Okay. I mean, my concern is I know that using firm load as reserves is something the CAISO does. I don't know if that is also something that EIM BAAs do, or whether they've got some other kind of response to an emergency, such that focusing only on that particular criterion would unreasonably disadvantage the CAISO BAA.
Well, I do think the functionality to do that would be open under NERC and WEC rules to all EIM participants. I cannot speak to the practices of the other EIM entities, though. But okay. I do understand your concern.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Bonnie. I think we can move on to the next slide. This last slide details talks about the companion analysis that Guillermo and Rahul and their team put together on the intertie uncertainty adder that gets added within the RSC. This is to track uncertainty essentially that has materialized over the last 90 days on the ties. I think what their analysis showed, if you go through it, is that there are a very sizable portion of the capacity test failures that, but for this adder, would not have been present. I think it's almost half of the failures that they identified. So that confirms to us, at least, that this adder is having a big impact on how EIM entities can participate. The other thing that it shows is that 95% confidence interval using that 90-day look back may not be a great predictor of intertie uncertainty going forward in the future. In recognition of this, the ISO wants to have additional discussion on this and potentially revise the way this intertie adder is calculated in the second phase of this initiative. That the timing that the ISO is able to get this analysis out on probably doesn't leave us the ability to do a lot of additional policy development on this topic, but we do recognize that this does impact the EIM, and it may not be designed as well as it could be, and we are open to redesigning this and working with the stakeholder community to make sure that we're correctly trying to predict intertie uncertainty and accurately adding that to the requirements of the RSC. I see we have a few questions.
Hi, this is Kevin Morlock from PNM. If based off the information that you've found so far that there's not accurately capturing future uncertainty, why is it being pushed off and not being addressed more in a sooner, more timely manner?
I think the blunt answer is we're scheduled to take the phase one of this initiative to a December approval. And with the timing of the comment period of this and then getting the documentation ready for that, which typically is in the first part of December, there just isn't time for another round of soliciting ideas, creating a proposal, and receiving stakeholder feedback. And then on that, it's just we're short on time with the schedule of phase one of this initiative.
So what about removing it in entirety? removing that requirement and then removing it from the calculation.
I don't think that's something that we would want to do right now either. Like, just because the requirement isn't as accurate as it could be doesn't mean that it doesn't serve a purpose.
I don't think it's very accurate at all, and it's causing more angst and challenges for the entire community as opposed to taking it out and then revisiting it as part of phase 2.
Okay, that's something we hadn't given thought to. If you could detail that in your comments, we can consider that.
Thank you.
Hi, Danny. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX again.
Hey, Jeff.
Hey, I just wanted to raise an additional topic that wasn't in the slide but was discussed briefly in the final proposal, which is the solar forecast error that was observed in the analysis performed on the heat wave from 2020. And the CAISO in the proposal saying it's not planning to address this issue, and I just wanted to raise that because that analysis showed that in the peak hours during the August 2020 heat wave, the solar forecast error was as much as about 1,800 megawatts off of the actual production. And when we had took a look at some of the other time periods around that summer as well as this year, it looks like there are regularly instances in which the forecast is off by significant quantities, 1,000 megawatts or more, like we saw during that period. And oftentimes that error is occurring in the same direction where the forecast going into the test is much higher than the actual solar production. And so it really seems like there's an issue there with the accuracy, and it's very significant. And so I just wanted to ask why the CAISO does not plan to address that or doesn't feel that it's necessary to do that, just given the fact that it was a significant source of the inaccuracy during that period.
Thanks for raising this, Jeff. So I think that chart that you're referring to is the forecast that was used by the RSC and the RTD dispatch. So to us, it's a little bit of comparing apples to oranges. One is a forecast, while the other is a dispatch that considers congestion. I think that if we want to talk about when we freeze the forecasts that are used for the RSC, that's one discussion. We also have the uncertainty that we've added to the capacity test, which we think accounts for a lot of forecast error, but taking the additional step to verify the deliverability of renewable energy forecasts in that prospective RSC isn't something that we've heard a lot of feedback supporting so far in this process. I think we raised this at the very beginning, and basically the feasibility test which we run is advisory, but I think what you're proposing is to almost take that feasibility test and haircut forecasts based off feasibility, which, if that's the direction that we want to go in, is something we can talk about, but is not something we've heard support for so far.
I have not made any suggestion about doing a feasibility assessment. All I'm saying is that if your solar forecast in advance of the sufficiency test or in advance of the hour being used for the sufficiency test is 1,800 megawatts more than your actual production hour after hour, there's a problem there. So I think that's fairly straightforward. I haven't seen any data or analysis to suggest what the cause of that is, but it's clearly inaccurate. So I don't think we've really talked about it. I think we've raised it a couple of times looking for more feedback around what some of the issues are. But ultimately, I mean, I think at the highest level, we're just trying to find ways to make sure that the test is accurate, and that seems to be, a significant source of inaccuracy, at least during those periods that we were looking into.
Hey, Jeff, thank you for the feedback. And I can add some context to this. One of the items that we have to be careful to characterize is whether we are taking a specific period of time to characterize the overall trend of the forecast. As you know, the forecast is very sensitive to weather conditions, and when we go back and check the summer conditions, we indeed describe the event that at that point in time there were a lot of moving variables to the forecast, including the weather conditions, and we put some graphics to explain how that quickly moved. And it was not just the solar, it was also the wind. And if you go and check now for the 2021 summer, you are going to see that there are days where actually the other way around. So I want to make sure that we don't presume that it's always in one direction, and it's not that we are not looking at that closely, but we have to recognize that at the end of the day, it's a forecast. And if the weather is going to be changing dramatically in a matter of an hour, the forecast is going to try to track that as much as it can. So it can go in either direction. Obviously, you look at one specific period of time, you may be a trend based on those weather conditions. You take another period and you may see a different trend. So I would be careful to generalize that it's always one problem in one single direction. And I would refer to the explanation that we provide in the analysis as to why the weather conditions were changing so much and why the load, wind, and solar forecasts were having a struggle on those days, just precisely because of the weather conditions. So we are open to have that discussion. We closely monitor the accuracy of the forecast, and if there are any other elements that we can tune to improve that, then we will do it. But I want to make sure that the context is properly set up in this discussion.
Thanks, Guillermo. I appreciate that, and I recognize and agree with you that it is a forecast, and there will be errors, and it's not going to be perfect. I think we after we saw the size of the errors that were occurring from the CAISO's analysis during that heat wave period of 2020, we did look at other periods as well, and it looked like there were many instances and periods of time where it seemed as though there was a persistent overstatement of the forecast relative to the actual production, and that's why we felt like, given the magnitude as well as the apparent sort of one-directional nature of that error, that there must be something else driving that. And I think what you're describing is exactly right, which is just review of that information to try to improve upon that forecast, or at least validate that it's functioning correctly on an ongoing basis is necessary. And that's why, from a transparency point of view, we also asked for more ongoing data transparency around how these forecasts are functioning. And then I think that will help to make it clear whether or not those types of errors are persistent, or if they're random, or if something else needs to occur. But either way, I do think that from what we've looked at so far, it does seem like there are some issues there that could benefit from some further review.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And we actually put in the MPPF the statistics of our forecast errors for the load, wind, solar, day ahead, and real time. If you believe there are better ways to portray the information, we would be happy to expand the metrics so that we can provide the transparency that people are expecting.
Okay, thanks, Guillermo.
Thanks, Guillermo. I think the last thing I wanted to add on that, Jeff, was, again, if we want to compare apples to apples here, we probably need to compare the forecast that's used by the RSC with more of a real-time forecast rather than the RTD dispatch, since short of running a feasibility check on the forecast in the RSC timeframe, there will be potential differences due to congestion.
Sure, and that may be the right thing to do. I'm not sure that if that data is available for stakeholders to do or not. But if you think that there are better metrics to evaluate, I think that's logical. I think we want to try to get the best apples-to-apples comparison that we can. So I agree with you on that.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Guillermo, for helping to fill in some of the detail on that. I see we have another question in the queue.
Hi, Danny. Tyler Moore, APS again, and I'm just piggybacking off of Jeff there on the VER aspect of the uncertainty here. One question, the paper does mention quantile regression to be implemented sometime in the future. I was wondering if we had an idea. I haven't seen it planned for implementation yet, or when that might go in.
So I believe it's planned for implementation as part of our FRP refinements policy, which is in 2022.
Okay, so spring 2022, I think that one is. Or did it get moved?
I know it was spring 2022. I don't know where it is, if it's still there or if it's been moved, but it's planned definitely for 2022.
Yeah,
and then
Brad, fall 2022.
Okay.
Fall, okay.
I wasn't sure if that was public yet, Brad.
And then just on your conversation there about why the uncertainty between the forecast and the real-time dispatch can be different due to congestion, is it also true that and I'm assuming that's what's going into the uncertainty component for VERS, if it's using the RTD dispatch and the VER has a bid, an economic bid, and is dispatched down, would that not show up as uncertainty? That shouldn't show up uncertainty if it's comparing forecast to dispatch, and I would agree it'd be better just to compare forecast to forecast.
Yeah, I think the interaction with VERs that are dispatched down due to congestion and how that would be considered is something that we probably need to think through and part of trying to get our apples-to-apples comparison here to see if there is a issue that we might want to address.
Okay, and is that true just of that chart that was used, or is that true in terms of the uncertainty that goes into the RFE test? Is it the dispatch versus the forecast, or is it the forecast to forecast for EIM entities? I'm trying to see if it's actually in the test or if that was just what was utilized in the graph you were discussing.
That was the graphic in the discussion. I would have to go back and check regarding the detailed implementation.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Hi, this is Ryan from Portland General. I think I'm a little turned around on implementation target timelines because I thought I had read somewhere in the proposal that the quantile regression methodology would be implemented prior to phase 1 of this proposal. I understood the quantile regression to be part of the FlexRamp deliverability, which is listed under spring 2022. So did that change? Is it now fall? And when is the implementation of phase 1 targeted for?
So I believe that now it's public that is planned fall of 2022 implementation for quantile regression as part of FRP refinements. I think our target for this would still be a spring release of 2022 if possible, but I know our technologies team is still going through their impact assessments and working to determine if that's even feasible.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, hearing no other questions, next slide, turn it back over to Jimmy.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks, folks. Great questions. As mentioned, next steps for this initiative, but first, we are proposing that the CAISO staff believes that the EIM governing body has joint authority with the Board of Governors over the tariff rule changes proposed in phase 1. We are targeting joint approval in November. However, that's still tentative, so look for that to be formally noticed. And the changes will be applicable to the EIM, BAA, EIM entities, or other participants within the EIM, BAA in their capacity as participants. So just to clarify that. And then as mentioned, here's the next steps. look for the board date to be noticed. It's still tentative, but we will have exact dates for that once we know. And then, as mentioned, once we have everything together, the business requirements specs and the draft tariff language will present it as one package as a final proposal for further discussion. So once more, folks, this call was recorded. You can look for that to be posted on the initiative webpage within the next few business days. I'd expect by the end of this week. And with that, we look forward to your comments. Again, thanks for your attendance, and please have a great rest of your day.
Jimmy, I think we have a couple more commenters in the queue. Since we have time, I'd like to try to let them.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure those were left over. Okay, yeah, go ahead, operator, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
I think I heard a beep. Can you hear me?
Yep. Go ahead. Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, thanks. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Have to get used to listening to that double beep now when I get unmuted. Just kind of following up on Ryan's question a little bit about overall timing. I remember Greg Cook, I think maybe in one of the last board updates, talking about kind of the timing for policy development for phase 2 of this, and I'm still a little bit confused on that. Is the idea that you would start into policy development for the phase 2 items after the board approves the phase 1 items in December, or is it more that you're waiting to work on any of the policy development for that until after the phase 1 implementation, so more like fall or winter of 2022 getting going on phase 2?
Yeah, I think, Dan, that's the type of feedback we're actually trying to look for. I think we're definitely committed to starting the policy development in 2022 on this. The specifics as to when, I think it would be helpful to understand what's the timing that stakeholders need that policy development for 2022 or the phase 2 to be completed by. What's driving that? So that's the feedback we're looking for, and then we can try to incorporate that into planning out our policy development for the next couple of years.
Okay. And then not to kind of reopen this too far, but when Bonnie from Six Cities was asking about some of the potential triggers for limitations or things to consider in the future, I was just curious if the CAISOs discussed whether any of the stage 2 emergency programs that were developed this summer might also be a reasonable trigger either for phase 1 or for consideration in phase 2. Things like the programs that were developed to allow, to get additional generation out of the ports, or for allowing some leeway in air permits for certain units. The work you did with DOE, or even the program for the couple units that were put into place in your work with CDWR for that additional 120 megawatts. If like dispatch of any of those programs might be a trigger that's as clear-cut or similar to the arming of firm load, or kind of how you might think about that. So maybe just something to follow up on in a future meeting.
Yeah, I think my initial reaction to that would be those are kind of extreme measures that the ISO would be taking to secure additional capacity, not risking firm load to secure additional capacity. So I think it's something that we consider, but my initial stab is that those might not be appropriate triggers to prevent EIM access.
Okay, so I see the differentiation there. That does make sense to an extent, because that's kind of more out of market securing of capacity, but not in a way that would put you closer to shedding firm load. Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
I think the issue that was identified with the arming of firm load is you're literally using firm load, which shouldn't be shed as reserves to not have to you're doing that to not proactively be shedding load, which I would view differently than out-of-market actions to secure additional capacity.
Okay. Yeah, that's good feedback on that. Thanks. That's all I had.
Thank you.
Next caller, please go ahead.
Sorry. It's Mark Simons at Bonneville again. Given that we have a little bit of time, you guys didn't provide a lot of commentary on your analysis about the NSI, at least I think it'd be useful if we spent a little bit of time here talking about the conclusions that you all appear to be reaching. I think that'd be useful for the discussion, particularly in light of the comment made by the caller from PNM. Danny, did you hear me?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. I was saying, which slide would you want to go back to? Is this the intertie uncertainty calculation?
Exactly. It's not so much in the slides, but it's
okay.
You know, if you could speak a bit more to the separate analysis that you all published and the fact that the NSI uncertainty is contributing, what looks to be contributing to 50%-ish of the failures taking place in the period that you all analyzed?
Yeah, I think at a high level, that was my takeaway, is this has a real significant impact on the amount of failures we're seeing. And then based off some of the plots in the latter part of that analysis, it isn't necessarily a good indicator of future uncertainty. But I would like to see if we have Guillermo or Rahul on the phone, since they were the authors of that, and I think they can speak to it a little bit more credibly than me.
Hey, Danny, this is Guillermo. Yeah, and sorry, I was not to take on this explicitly, but the idea of the analysis that we did is obviously because there has been discussions about the other related to the intertie deviation, and we wanted to see how that's performing. I think there has been a few questions in the past in that area, and we just spent some time to put some metrics together. And the analysis consists of two main parts. The first one is similar to the uncertainty component that we have assessed through the summer enhancements. We wanted to see what is the contribution of the uncertainty adder to the frequency of failures across the different EIM entities. And in that case, we have basically a very simple setup. One is we know what the final outcome of the test was under the current construct that contains the adder, or that includes the adder. And we do a counterfactual, effectively discounting the adder, and see if the failure that we originally had is completely offset by that amount of the adder, to determine whether the adder is sufficient enough to drive the failure. And that is how we derive the comparison with and without the adder to size the frequency of the failure related to the inclusion of the uncertainty of the intertie deviation. The second part is less transparent, but the idea is, at the end of the day, the adder is a mechanism that is utilized currently in the test to somehow account for the intertie deviation that may happen in the given time frame. Like any other logic that we may have in place in order to predict the future, you need a reference, and that reference is the historical performance. The current construct of the adder relies on the last 90 days of historical intertie deviation. We construct a histogram, we get a percentile up and down, and the expectation is that within that confidence band, you should be able to cover the historical uncertainty, and hopefully that is going to be closely tracking the intertie deviation that may happen at a given time when you're running the test. Therefore, a very intuitive measure to see how effective the adder is performing is to quantify what the requirement was based on the historical intertie deviation and compare that against the actual intertie deviation that happened on that time. So let me put an example. If we are looking for the adder, for the intertie deviation that happens in our ending 11 right now, right? And we know that there could be a potential an intertie deviation of 100 megawatts. We compare that actual intertie deviation for that hour against the intertie deviation requirement that was calculated for that hour for the last 90 days, and see how effectively the other is covering the actual deviation that realizes by the time we are doing the test. And that is the set of metrics that we put in the second part of the report. And there is a reference line, a dotted line, and then you have two bins in the plot. I don't have the report in front of me, but one is to quantify the frequency when there is enough coverage by the other, meaning the actual intertide deviation that realizes is within the magnitude of the other. So we are properly accounting for the intertide deviation based on this historical performance. The other bin is when the actual intertide deviation is not covered by the actual requirement, so it basically exceeds the requirement. And that is a case where basically we didn't have sufficient other to cover the actual intertide deviation. And there was one last section, and that is an attempt to try to see how different, it's a sensitivity analysis, it's trying to quantify how different the requirement and the coverage of that other would be if instead of using the 97.5 and the 2.5 percentiles, we use a different percentile. How dramatic the change in the magnitude of the other potentially be. There are many more combinations and permutations we can try to assess. I think this is just the starting point of analyzing how that other is working. And I think the main caution I would put based on this is that the current logic, the current framework is using another that is based on historical performance. That is the basis, right? Whether we use a histogram or any other methodology that could be more sophisticated may still be predicated on somehow using historical information. And that could be potentially the main challenge, because if we realize that the historical information is not good enough under the current construct to assess the actual intertide deviation, the natural question is going to be, what else could be better than that? And we can explore different permutations, like using different percentiles of the histogram. We could use a different sample of the data. Instead of 90 days, we could use other time frame. There are pros and cons. The shorter window you have for the historical data, the more spiky and more volatile the sample can be. It's going to be less robust. If we want to use more data points, maybe taking a longer period, we run into the risk that there is seasonality conditions that may not be captured when you go too far in the past. There may be other variations. Instead of using the last 90 days, maybe we can use the same period of last year. There are areas where we can explore how we could tweak it and try to make it more accurate. But I think one of the complications is if the construct is still based on historical data, there is some inherent limitation. And somehow that is the reason we move from using the histogram approach of the flexible ramping requirement towards something that is more properly accounting for more closer to real-time conditions. That is now the quantized regression and takes into account the forecasted variables for wind load and solar. So I think there is a lot of discussion on this to be made, and we wanted to put this in front of you just to start giving you transparency about how that other is so far impacting the outcome of the test and how well that other is covering for the actual intertide deviation. That would be a brief summary of what the intent and the scope of the analysis is.
And then just to follow up a little bit further, the last set of graphics in the report itself, the P2.75 is the actual requirement, right? That's a reflection of the 95% confidence.
Yes,
is that right? And then the fact that it says the absolute difference like if I were just looking at APS because it's the first one in the list, the absolute difference being negative on a recurring basis in these hours selected is an indicator that the test is counting more uncertainty than actually occurred. Is that the right way to interpret the green dots relative being below the black line?
Sorry, I'm not in front of the computer right now. I don't have a good visualization of what you may be referring to, and I would have to get back to you.
Okay, I think that would be good to kind of put it in a little bit more plainer English, if you will. The summary of those charts is not as easy to follow as maybe it could be. But that being said, really appreciate you guys putting together this analysis and helping stimulate the conversation. Particularly for these options, I would suspect changing, the confidence interval being covered is an easier fix than maybe removing it entirely. Well, maybe that's even easier. I don't know. But it'd be good to have some feedback from you all regarding what could be some relatively easy fixes versus, obviously which ones are more complicated and take time that are encouraging you guys to push it off until phase 2.
Yeah, thank you for the feedback. And if there is any else we can do to better portray the information, we would be happy to do so. I would appreciate if you can put anything in the written comments so that we can take it from there.
Happy to. Thanks, Guillermo.
Thank you, Mark.
Caller or host, is there anybody else in the queue?
No one else in the queue.
Okay. Jimmy, it's all yours.
Yeah, thanks, Danny and Guillermo, for going off script, and thanks again for the question. And as mentioned, folks, this recording will be posted soon. I think we've already went over everything else, and with that, you've got some time back, so please have a great rest of your day.